Hello again everyone. Today we're going to talk about chapters 7 and 8, and in particular the fate of Justine Moritz in these chapters. Make sure you've read them and we'll begin. Justine is the housekeeper for the Frankenstein family. We don't learn very much about her character except that of course she embodies the idea of suffering for a just cause. It seems ironic then that her name deliberately invokes ideas of justice or perhaps even injustice. Some have argued that Justine's death illustrates the true nature of Victor Frankenstein's enemy, the monster he created. The monster frames Justine for the murder of Victor's youngest brother, William, a murder that we discover the monster himself committed. Of course, Frankenstein suspects this long before it's revealed to us. Justine is swiftly executed for this crime. Ask yourself, is the monster calculating and malicious? Does he plan ahead to bring down Victor and everyone he knows and loves? If you think so, then clearly Justine's death is the monster's most callous crime. Justine goes to her death suffering in noble silence. She tells Frankenstein and Elizabeth that she is innocent. Elizabeth defends her valiantly and eloquently in court, but of course, as an 18th century woman, her opinions are quickly ignored by the judge and jury. Victor, on the other hand, who you might expect to rush to Justine's defence, and in fact this is how he's depicted in Kenneth Branagh's film version of Frankenstein, Victor, suspecting as he does that the creature he made was responsible for William's death, he sits guiltily in the public gallery, silent. The scene is reminiscent of the biblical scene of Christ's betrayal by his disciple Judas, and the biblical notes of Justine's self-sacrifice don't stop there. Again, unlike in the ridiculously dramatic film version, Justine doesn't struggle against the court or the crowd that have gathered to condemn her. She embodies the archetypal woman of innocence, kindness, beauty, and nurture. She pleads her innocence with a certain nobility. She says, "I hope the character I have always borne will incline my judges to a favourable interpretation." Note how eloquent she is in her own defence as well. Victor describes her as the most amiable and benevolent of human creatures. The reader knows that she is innocent because she was warmly attached to the child, William, and was like a most affectionate mother. Shelley, in fact, lays it on pretty thick, describing Justine's perfect innocence and her mild eyes, which seemed incapable of any severity or guile. She's not going to trick anyone. To her last moments, Justine serves other people, and we see again this depiction of women as selfless and suffering as a result. She is described as the poor sufferer who tried to comfort others. So this idea of suffering. There are lots of examples of female suffering in the canon of Western literature. We know from studying Shakespeare, for example, that 17th century audiences were obsessed with the pantomimic and appalling persecution of women that took place during witch trials. Before that, Christian tradition was full of the stories of female martyrs. You've got the examples of St. Catherine, Joan of Arc, and St. Agatha. You might want to look up why Francisco de Zurbarán painted her with this rather alarming plateful. Justine fits this archetype of the female martyr. She holds firm in her claims of innocence and is calm even in the face of death. By contrast with Shelley's description of Victor's raging guilt, Victor himself notes how the appearance of Justine was calm. And she's said to comment three really interesting things. "I must be condemned. I am resigned. I do not fear to die. That pang is past." Pause the video there, and I'd like you to annotate some of these key quotations that I've picked out for you, asking yourself, how does Shelley depict Justine's death as archetypally feminine? So as well as fitting this archetype in a way that is an obvious commentary on the passive, accepting role that women in the early 19th century were expected to play, the episode of Justine's death is used by Shelley to make a withering political attack. So what's the legal and political context of chapter 7 and chapter 8? Of course, you will have spotted the influence of Shelley's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, on this episode. In A Vindication of the Rights of Women, Wollstonecraft proposed that the Constitution should protect both women's and men's rights. If you need a reminder of that, go back to, I think it's lesson 3 on Mary Wollstonecraft. Shelley provides an exceedingly emotive illustration of the need to protect women's rights. And her attack on the legal system of her time goes further and is in fact much more specific than that. Now, Patrick Vincent is a critic who has highlighted the importance of Justine's trial and its political and legal contexts. He explores Mary Shelley's use of Geneva as a response to the British government's arbitrary repressive measures in 1817. So, Geneva is the setting for Justine's trial and execution. Among a number of laws introduced in that year, 1817, the Habeas Corpus Suspension Act was particularly significant. The Home Secretary, Lord Sidmouth, introduced the law, saying there was a traitorous conspiracy for the purpose of overthrowing the established government. He referred to a malignant spirit, which had brought such disgrace upon the domestic character of the people, and had long prevailed in the country, but especially since the commencement of the French Revolution. So they were worried. The British establishment were terrified of uprising. And so they introduced new laws which oppressed and restricted the people of the country to try and deal with it. Now, I'm not a politician, but you have got to think, what seems like a quick way to incite people to revolt against you? Maybe try introducing laws that take away all their freedoms? Now, Vincent argues that the point of introducing Justine's trial is to dramatise the resemblances between revolutionary violence and arbitrary law. In other words, poor people, minorities and women had a pretty rough time of it in the legal system of the 17th and 18th centuries. They continued to have a rough time of it during the French Revolution, which had been sold to them on the basis of gaining individual freedom, and England hadn't even had a revolution, so was even further behind. Shelley felt that this needed to change, and quickly. Vincent argues that Shelley's novel is not about revolutionary politics, but in fact makes a powerful case for legitimate rule of law. A legitimate rule of law that strictly upholds rational, codified principles. So, remarkably, you might want to look at how that's in fact a very Hobbesian interpretation of Frankenstein. In this way, perhaps Shelley is using Justine's death not as a passionate, romantic, with a capital R, evocation of the need for revolution. Maybe instead it's much more enlightenment, rational, methodical, scientific even, in its approach to what can we do to achieve justice. So those are the political ramifications of this scene. Of course, there are personal ramifications for Victor too, as he is telling us all about Justine's hanging. Victor feels tremendously guilty over this death, and he does torture himself endlessly over it. He feels in some way that Justine's murder is the worse of the two, William's being the other one, that he's responsible for. He says the other far more dreadfully murdered, referring to Justine. And later, while sick and incarcerated in Ireland, so much later, he calls himself the murderer of William and Justine. So there are two big arguments that Shelley is putting forwards in this particular episode. On the one hand, the argument that maybe Victor and his monster are one and the same. Perhaps the reason that Victor shares in the monster's guilt so much is because there is no monster. It is just Victor. We'll explore that, which is known as the doppelganger theory. We'll explore that theory in a future lesson. The other key argument that Shelley puts across here is that, because she's a typical romantic, this addiction that Victor has to discover new things, his thirst for knowledge, clearly, if it leads to incidents like the death of Justine, clearly it is a destructive impulse. That enlightenment impulse is a destructive one. Okay, so you're now going to take that work that we've done on Justine, apply it to what we previously learnt about William, and you can do a piece of writing about these innocent victims. I'll see you next time.